Joe Braven is the owner of a logging company. One day, his colleague, Weston, was scheduled to deliver a load of timber. Joe requested the delivery be postponed until the following morning due to a forecasted storm. However, Weston insisted on making the delivery that day because he had personal matters to attend to. If the storm really hit, he planned to stay overnight at Joe's cabin. After work, Joe returned home. He lives with his wife, Stephanie, their daughter, Charlotte, and his father, Lyndon, who suffers from dementia, a condition that impairs memory and cognitive function. Joe deeply cares for his family and is known as a man who places great importance on his responsibilities toward his loved ones. That night, after reading Charlotte a bedtime story about a clever bear that knew how to hide, Joe tucked her in. When he went to speak with his father, he realized that Lyndon wasn't in the house. It turned out Lyndon had wandered off to a bar. The bar owner called Joe, asking him to come pick up his father. In his confused state, Lyndon had caused a disturbance. He tried to take a young woman home, mistakenly thinking she was his wife. Naturally, the woman refused and became upset. Joe rushed to the bar and found his father being assaulted by 3 men. Without hesitation, Joe fought them off. One of the men was struck in the head with a glass and seriously injured. After neutralizing the threat, Joe brought Lyndon to the hospital. A police officer named Cal arrived and informed Joe that one of the attackers had a history of armed assault. Cal, who had known Joe for years, expressed sympathy but also issued a warning. If such incidents happened again, Lyndon would have to be taken into custody for everyone's safety. The doctor then explained that Lyndon's head wound had been stitched, but his mental condition was deteriorating further, especially after a car accident the previous year. Because both Joe and his wife were busy with work, the doctor recommended placing Lyndon in a nursing home. Joe firmly rejected the idea. He was determined to care for his father himself. After they were discharged, Charlotte gave her grandfather a handmade bracelet as a gift of love. The family then returned home. Meanwhile, before reaching the delivery site, Weston met with his associate, Hallett. They had planned a smuggling operation. Hallett concealed several logs inside Weston's truck, logs that contained hidden packages of drugs disguised among the rest of the timber. During the trip, the truck skidded on the icy road, overturned, and caught fire. Despite the crash, Weston and Hallett managed to retrieve the drug-filled logs before the police arrived. They transferred the drugs into duffel bags and fled the scene. Their plan was to hide the bags at Joe's cabin and return to collect them the next day. Soon after the crash, the police arrived and transported Weston and Hallett to a nearby hotel for the night. The damaged truck would be handled by the authorities. Elsewhere, a drug syndicate boss named Casson met one of his dealers, Joe, at a bar. Upon hearing from Hallett that the truck had crashed and the drugs were now hidden at Joe's cabin, Casson flew into a rage. He brutally killed Joe on the spot, blaming him for the failure. Back at Joe's house, he remained burdened by his father's condition. Stephanie tried to comfort him and suggested that he take Lyndon to the cabin for a short retreat to clear their minds and spend quality time together. The cabin was a special place for Lyndon, filled with memories. The next morning, after breakfast, Joe invited his father to the cabin, telling him he needed help boarding up the walls in preparation for winter. After a long drive, they arrived at the cabin. There, Joe began discussing the doctor's recommendation to place Lyndon in a nursing home. Joe emphasized that he didn't want to go down that path, but circumstances were forcing his hand. He promised to look for other solutions that would allow him to continue caring for his father. However, Lyndon felt hurt and angry. He ignored Joe's explanation and stepped outside to calm himself. Meanwhile, Casson and his men picked up Weston and Hallett from the hotel. They drove straight to the cabin to retrieve the hidden drugs. As they reached the entrance to the cabin's remote area, Weston noticed fresh tire tracks in the snow, indicating that Joe was already there. He knew there was only one road in and out of the area, and there was no cell signal. Upon hearing this, Casson immediately ordered his men to spread out and surround the cabin with full weaponry. Weston started to panic. He realized the situation had escalated far beyond his expectations. What had begun as a scheme to earn some extra money had now turned into a life-threatening operation. Weston offered to speak to Joe calmly and resolve things peacefully, but Casson rejected the idea outright. He showed no concern for anyone's safety and instructed his crew to surround the cabin and be ready to eliminate anyone who got in their way. When Joe entered the shed, he was shocked to find several bags filled with packets of drugs. His father, Lyndon, was equally surprised. He had noticed footprints in the snow and that the shed's lock had been broken. They had no idea where the drugs had come from. Suddenly, someone entered the shed. It was Charlotte, Joe's daughter, who had secretly hidden in the car trunk before they left. Realizing that something was clearly wrong and dangerous, Joe immediately took Charlotte and Lyndon back to the car. Meanwhile, Casson's men had already taken up positions to launch an attack. One of them even had Joe and Lyndon in his sights from the front seat of a vehicle, but Joe, suspicious after seeing a deer flee in panic, sensed something was off. Fortunately, the enemy's line of sight was blocked by a tree. Joe quickly reversed and rushed back to the cabin. Once inside, they closed all the curtains. Charlotte was hidden in a small room. Lyndon took position on the second floor with a rifle, and Joe attempted to call for help using a radio. Unfortunately, the signal was weak and he couldn't reach anyone. When Joe checked in with his father, he was stunned to discover that one of the attackers was his own coworker, Weston. In an effort to resolve the situation, Joe approached Casson and his group, carrying a portion of the drug-filled bags. Joe knew that if he handed over everything, they would likely kill him to keep him quiet. So he only offered half of the stash and threatened to burn the rest if they harmed him. Joe demanded they leave and promised to hand over the remaining drugs at a bar in an hour. But Casson refused, saying it was too complicated. He wanted all the drugs immediately, or Joe's family would be killed. When Weston tried to reason with Joe and persuade him to cooperate, Casson, offended by Weston's interference, shot him in the head, killing him instantly. Joe returned to the cabin, now resolute in his decision not to give in. He was convinced that no matter what, they would kill him anyway, so he began to prepare, crafting wooden arrows, relocating Charlotte to a safer room, and instructing Lyndon to shoot the sniper when given the signal. Once everything was ready, Joe tossed a bag in front of the cabin door. One of Casson's men opened it, only to find it was filled with toys. Joe immediately became a target and was chased by Casson and his men. Meanwhile, Hallett and a sniper continued to watch over Lyndon. Joe, however, had not only taken the decoy bag, he had also brought Charlotte with him. He asked his daughter to climb to the top of a hill to find a phone signal and call her mother, Stephanie, for help. Riding an ATV, Joe led Casson's vehicle on a wild chase until they lost track of him. Casson realized Joe wasn't heading for the main road. He was circling back to the cabin to save his father. Casson moved to a higher position to gain a better vantage point, instructing his men to drive Joe in that direction. Back home, Stephanie discovered that Charlotte had gone to the cabin with Joe. Meanwhile, Charlotte reached the top of the hill and attempted to contact her mother. At the same time, Casson managed to shoot Joe, causing him to fall. He then ordered his men to retrieve the drugs and finish Joe off. But when they opened the bag, it wasn't drugs inside. Joe immediately launched an attack. He even managed to trap one of the enemies by tying his leg to the ATV, threatening to throw him off a cliff. Charlotte finally succeeded in reaching her mother, who immediately called Officer Cal to head to the cabin. Charlotte also told her mom she would wait at the Blue Mountain guard post. Meanwhile, Casson found a child's toy, which convinced him that Joe's daughter was nearby. He sent one of his men to the hilltop to stop Charlotte from calling for help. Joe changed into clothes taken from one of the dead attackers and slashed the tires of Casson's car before heading back to the cabin. Inside, Lyndon had to face off with Hallett. Clearly out of his depth and unfamiliar with guns, Hallett panicked and fired wildly into the cabin before entering. But Lyndon fought back with surprising courage and overpowered him. Joe, who was still being pursued, climbed up a tree wearing only a jacket. But before he could attack, Casson arrived, forcing Joe to flee back to the cabin. Lyndon struggled to locate the enemy sniper. Once Joe made it back inside, they came under heavy fire from Casson and two of his men. Joe tried to calm his father, who had become disoriented again after being hit by broken glass. Elsewhere, Charlotte, still being chased by one of Casson's men, was saved when an arrow pierced the attacker's hand. It was Stephanie who had fired it. She stabbed the enemy multiple times. Charlotte was then found by Officer Cal and his partner. As Casson switched weapons, Joe moved his father to the shed. The enemies surrounded the cabin, but Joe managed to kill two of Casson's men in brutally efficient ways. Unfortunately, Casson managed to capture Lyndon. With no other choice, Joe promised to hand over the remaining bags of drugs in exchange for his father's release. But Casson ignored the plea and brutally stabbed Lyndon in the stomach. Right after the attack, Officer Cal tried to shoot Casson as he fled into the cabin, but the attempt failed. Lyndon, gravely wounded, drew his final breath in his son Joe's arm. Just as one of Casson's men was about to shoot Joe, Stephanie appeared at the perfect moment and shot the attacker with an arrow, saving Joe's life. Now only Casson remained. He grabbed the remaining bag of drugs from inside the cabin and shot Cal. Fortunately, the bullet didn't hit any vital organs, and Cal survived. Casson then transferred all the drugs from his vehicle into a single bag and fled the scene. But Joe, consumed by grief and rage over his father's death, refused to let him get away. He gathered what he needed and immediately gave chase. Meanwhile, Stephanie was finally reunited with Charlotte. Shortly after, police vehicles began arriving at the scene. Joe, having located Casson's position, set up a tripwire trap to distract him. When Casson was momentarily distracted, Joe grabbed the bag of drugs and threw it to divert him while setting up a bear trap, tying it to a tree in the snowy terrain. Eventually, Joe and Casson came face to face. A fierce hand-to-hand battle broke out. Casson initially had the upper hand. When he spotted the bear trap, he laughed, mocking it as a pathetic, ineffective trick. Arrogantly, Casson declared that he would kill Joe, his wife, and his daughter, just as he had killed Lyndon. That was the final straw for Joe. Without hesitation, Joe lunged at Casson, tackling them both off the edge of a cliff. But the bear trap had not been left there by accident. Joe had planned everything. The trap was secured to save himself while ensuring Casson's death. With great effort, Joe climbed back up the cliff. Moments later, Stephanie and Charlotte arrived and embraced him with overwhelming relief. Casson's entire drug syndicate had been wiped out, brought down by Joe. But for Joe, the most important thing, despite all the chaos and loss, was that his wife and daughter were still alive.